Hello and welcome to Guidance Review. I'm David Pudwill, and today we're going to be talking about FDA's recent guidance document on technical considerations for non-clinical assessment of medical devices containing nitinol, published in October 2020. A couple key takeaways for today's video are: 1, general information about materials and manufacturing; 2, consideration for mechanical testing and analyses; and 3, recommendations for use of corrosion testing methods. So, without much further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. So here we are. We've got the guidance document up here. And if we go ahead and scroll down, we can download the final guidance document. And we can go check out the docket here. And if we go take a look, we see there are a couple attachments that we can open. I have the draft document open in another window. And we can also take a look at some comments. There are 13 comments. If we get into those, we can see we have a comment from AdvaMed. We also have a number of comments, a couple comments from some other companies, Gore and Cook, and then we have some individuals and anonymous comments that are made as well. And some of these comments have attachments, such as this from AdvaMed here, and this was from June 14, 2019. And AdvaMed represents a number of medical device and diagnostic manufacturers. And so I tend to like to open up AdvaMed's comments here because they'll include a number of perspectives, specifically from this association of medical device manufacturers. If we get in, there are something like 22 pages, or maybe it's only 20 pages here of AdvaMed comments. And I won't get into the weeds here, but these comments are, specifically, and this is sort of a good format if you're going to be providing comments to FDA. This makes it easier for them to incorporate your comment in the document, where you specifically address the line number that your comment applies to. Here there are some changes that are recommended. Change this statement from pseudoelasticity and shape memory behavior to mechanical shape memory and thermal shape memory behavior, or mechanical shape memory, pseudoelasticity, superelasticity shape memory, and thermal shape memory behavior. So as an example. And then they go through and include a reason for each of those changes that are recommended. And here you see there are tons and tons of changes recommended here by AdvaMed, some of which may be incorporated and some of which are definitely not included. And I could probably do a series of videos just on what changes were included and what weren't in terms of AdvaMed comments alone, much less the other 13. So it's a treasure trove of information here if you want to get into it. And it does give you some perspective in terms of those comments that are made specifically by AdvaMed, for instance, that don't get incorporated or that do get incorporated by FDA. It gives you some insight into FDA's perspective on some of these things. It also gives you the medical device manufacturer's perspective on some general issues and language and concerns that industry may have regarding some of the language that FDA uses in their guidance documents. And then we have the draft guidance document here that we can get into. This was issued on April 19th, 2019. And I have gone through and looked a little bit at how this compares. It's a 17-page draft guidance document here. And there are some differences between the draft, primarily just, first and foremost in some of the way this information is formatted. And then if we get into the actual guidance document, which is here, this was issued in October 2020, and this supersedes the draft. I guess it doesn't supersede, but this is the final version of that draft document that was issued on April 19th. And here we see, for questions about this document, you should contact the Division of Applied Mechanics at this number or this email address. There are a couple phone numbers here, I guess, that they give you. And then specifically, this is for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. There's a statement about public comment and additional copies. Then we get into the table of contents. I would just note here, I'm not sure if this ended up being some kind of a formatting issue that they had here under corrosion testing, because they call out some sub numbers here in terms of the corrosion testing in sort of an odd way. And here again, we have the title, this statement that this guidance represents the current thinking of the Food and Drug Administration, and then an introduction here about nitinol, which is an alloy of nickel and titanium, and it's a commonly used material in the medical device industry. And some more detail about nitinol's use in cardiovascular devices and in other device areas is identified here. And FDA specifically comments that they've developed this guidance to provide FDA's current thinking on technical considerations specific to devices using nitinol due to the unique properties of nitinol. And they make the note here that the recommendations of this document should be evaluated in conjunction with the intended use and technological characteristics of your device and any relevant device-specific guidances, of which there are going to be a number. And here FDA calls out recognized consensus standards and provides some links. And again, this statement that FDA's guidance documents, including this guidance, do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. They describe the agency's thinking on a topic and should be viewed only as recommendations unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. Here's some more background on nitinol and its unique properties, and some detail about the use of nitinol over 3 decades in medical devices, in what areas it's primarily been used in. FDA also calls out the increase of use over the past 2 decades into different device areas, and some of the specific mechanical properties. Shape memory here they call them pseudoelasticity. And given the complex properties of nitinol, characterizing the thermomechanical behavior of nitinol devices presents unique considerations when assessing safety and effectiveness. And here they call out literature, as well as some work done by ASTM, which we'll see later on in this document. And they specifically call out the consensus standards that aid the medical industry in characterizing nitinol. Here we see some details about the previous literature and a couple references. In vivo corrosion of nitinol may decrease the safety profile or performance of the device by adversely impacting thermomechanical properties and/or biocompatibility. To obtain stakeholder input regarding best practices for corrosion testing and the impact of corrosion on the performance and safety profile of metals, FDA held a workshop in 2012, and information gathered from that workshop was used to update FDA's guidance document here on non-clinical engineering tests and recommended labeling for intravascular stents and associated delivery systems. And here they call out that the recommendations of that guidance were specific to intravascular stents and their delivery systems. Here we have some definitions, and then we get into the technical recommendations. And here FDA specifically calls out that the type and amount of data necessary to support your regulatory submission will vary depending on the device design, intended use, and classification of the device type. And they recommend that the suggested information for each type of nitinol be provided, and where available, device-specific guidance documents should be considered. And here FDA calls out their Q-Sub program and recommends that you use it if appropriate, and also refers to the when to submit a 510K guidance document. And here FDA specifically calls out some of the biocompatibility exposures that might be relevant. This is some stock language that's being used, but effectively here, when FDA is calling out all of these types of devices, there's not a limit to what duration of use a device could fall into in terms of what FDA is expecting for this guidance document. That could be limited, prolonged, or it could be permanent. That basically means all medical devices. And then in terms of general information, here FDA calls out that the performance and behavior of nitinol depends on a number of factors, including alloy composition, thermal history, surface processing, and preconditioning, and based on the device design and intended use, different material behaviors or performance may be desirable. And FDA recommends to provide the following general information about the device for prolonged exposure and permanent contacting devices. And for limited exposure devices, some of this information may not be warranted based on device design and intended use. And again, they call out where device-specific guidances are available. These may be useful to determine what type of information is needed. And here, FDA also calls out engaging with FDA early in the process using, again, the Q submission process. Here's the information FDA suggests that you include. That would be material composition, some manufacturing detail, pseudoelasticity or shape memory behavior details, and transformation temperatures. So for material composition, FDA wants to understand if your nitinol conforms to a recognized consensus standard, such as ASTM F2063. And if your nitinol does not conform to a recognized consensus standard, FDA recommends you provide the nitinol composition and description of its specific properties. And then in terms of manufacturing, FDA would like to know the manufacturing method and parameters, including heat treatments and surface processing that could alter the behavior and performance of the device. And they want to see a high-level flow chart to identify the manufacturing processes leading from your raw material to the final device sterilization if relevant. And of specific interest are thermal processes, additional surface processing as well. And in addition, you should describe any final post-processing cleaning steps and discuss how these steps are designed to remove any surface residuals that could impact biocompatibility. And then in terms of the pseudoelasticity or shape memory behavior, here FDA again comments on the fact that nitinol can be tuned via composition and thermal treatments. And it should be stated in the submission which of these properties, the pseudoelastic or shape memory behavior, are being used. If neither behavior is being employed, that should also be clarified. And then in terms of transformation temperatures, FDA recommends you provide phase transformation temperatures of your final finished form. And when possible, samples from a minimum of 3 production lots should be used. Here, FDA gives some more details on what you should be doing if the pseudoelastic properties are being utilized to achieve the intended device performance. FDA also recommends using the methods described in ASTM F2004 and ASTM F2082 or an equivalent method. And here, FDA specifically calls out that for devices that are expected to be load-bearing, FDA recommends that ASTM F2082 be modified to assess the strain the device is expected to experience in its final finished form as it incorporates deformation. And here they call out alternative methods to assess transformation temperatures can be used with a detailed test protocol and explanation of how transformation temperatures are determined. And then some additional recommendations about providing specifications for body temperature, mechanical performance, or transformation temperature ranges for the device to ensure the device will perform as a pseudoelastic or shape memory material. And then FDA gets into the mechanical testing recommendations. Nitinol has unique thermomechanical behavior. When available, device-specific guidance or standards should be used to assess the mechanical performance of your device. If mechanical testing will be performed as part of your non-clinical testing plan, the following specific considerations may apply depending on device design and/or intended use. This could be experimental testing considerations. One, that's what was missing in all of this was missing up above. These sub-bullets weren't included in the table of contents. But experimental testing considerations, and here's some detail, and FDA specifically calls out an example of using ASTM F2477. Under experimental testing conditions, FDA here says that mechanical testing is commonly performed under displacement control, although other control modes may be appropriate. And given the unique thermomechanical behavior of nitinol, FDA recommends that you provide a rationale for the control mode used for mechanical testing. Some devices are designed such that they may be exposed to strains prior to and/or during implantation. Therefore, when appropriate, FDA recommends you account for any clinical deformations or forces and temperature excursions as a preconditioning step prior to mechanical testing of the device. And due to the thermomechanical response of nitinol, mechanical testing should be performed at a clinically relevant temperature. Some devices are exposed to cyclic loading conditions during use. If you conduct fatigue tests, FDA recommends that you use a clinically relevant liquid test solution. FDA does not recommend that you conduct fatigue tests of nitinol in air. And if you do so, you should provide a scientific justification. And for devices intended to utilize the shape memory properties of nitinol, FDA recommends a cyclic shape memory test at a clinically relevant temperature range and number of cycles. And then FDA gives some additional details here in terms of computational stress or strain analyses. If you plan to conduct computational analyses, you should follow these recommendations here. Document and justify the parameters used in the material model. Testing should be conducted at a temperature representative of the clinical use environment. Your computational analysis should include the effect of any shape-setting steps in your manufacturing process. If your device is subjected to cyclic loading during use, FDA recommends that you calculate fatigue safety factors using a constant life curve, and recommends that you state and justify method used to calculate mean and alternating strain for fatigue safety factors. And you should validate the computational model used to analyze the nitinol device and justify the validation activity relative to the context of use of the computational model, the risk and role of the computational model in decision making, and range of conditions assessed relative to those in the context of use. FDA also recommends that you justify your choice of parameter measured and loading path in your validation activities. And then FDA references this specific computational modeling studies and medical device submissions guidance. In terms of corrosion testing, nitinol's corrosion susceptibility is dependent on the manufacturing and surface finishing processes used to make the final finished form, as well as potentially the geometry of the final finished form. As corrosion can lead to nickel ion release or even compromise of the mechanical integrity of the device, FDA recommends that pitting corrosion testing of the nitinol device be performed for prolonged exposure and permanent contacting devices. And there are some recommendations below. If pitting corrosion testing results meet pre-specified acceptance criteria, and the device is manufactured using established surface finishing that has been used for devices with a good clinical history of use, such as electropolishing, chemical etch, or mechanical polishing, further testing may not be warranted. When considering the effect of manufacturing processes on surface finish, comparison of surface characterization results to an established surface finish may provide insight into the quality of your protective oxide layer. Due to the spot size limitations of surface characterization, this approach may not be appropriate to assess phenomena that are influenced by the entire surface if surface variability was established during corrosion testing. And if the results of testing do not meet pre-specified acceptance criteria, or your device is not manufactured using established surface finishing processes with a good clinical history of use, FDA recommends characterizing the extent of nickel ion release. And a flowchart is provided to illustrate the recommended testing paradigm. And here we have this figure. And here FDA specifically calls out that corrosion testing is generally not warranted for limited contact devices. However, such testing may be requested in situations such as devices with an electrically active component, a dissimilar metal couple, or a degradable metal polymer component, where these features could accelerate nitinol corrosion. And again, FDA references the Q-sub process here. In terms of pitting corrosion, FDA recommends conducting testing per ASTM F2129. Testing should be performed after subjecting the device to simulated assembly and implantation, which includes compression, loading, and deployment of the device through an in vitro fixture that mimics in vivo anatomic conditions. And alternatively, the device can be subjected to simulated use without the use of an in vitro fixture with justification. And here, the device conditioning is intended to simulate the clinical conditions of the device at the time of implantation. And you should look at worst case scenarios in terms of corrosion susceptibility based on surface area, size, and geometry. And consideration should be given to factors such as geometry or size that may affect surface finishing. And test devices should be representative of the final finished form. And FDA recommends manufacturing an uncoated version for coated devices that undergo identical processing. If the tested device did not undergo sterilization, a justification for why should be provided. And in addition, the number of samples tested and sampling scheme should be justified with consideration of variability in results. FDA says at least 6 samples will likely be warranted based on known variability. That's a minimum, not a recommended sample size. Here, FDA notes that if your worst case device size cannot be accommodated in the text fixture, then alternative device sizes could be used with a rationale. And then here, FDA calls out that test reports should include corrosion and rest potentials, breakdown potentials, as well as polarization curves. And when practical, they recommend that you plot all polarization curves in one graph and discuss any deviations from ASTM F2129. This is sort of standard information here about assessing your results against your acceptance criteria. Here are a couple studies that are linked in terms of in vitro versus in vivo corrosion. And here they note if breakdown occurred, you should include a visual inspection, and images of sufficient magnification should be provided to support your assessment. And then in terms of nickel ion release, if your nitinol device does not meet your pre-specified acceptance criteria for corrosion resistance or does not employ an established surface finishing process, then FDA recommends nickel ion release testing be performed per ASTM F3306. Some details are included here about what that testing should look like. And again, testing should be performed on devices in final finished form after preconditioning. And again, the validation testing should be performed and summarized in the test report. And there's some additional recommendations. If you're going to do this testing, read through and make sure you follow all of these recommendations in this section. And then in terms of galvanic corrosion, similar to pitting corrosion, galvanic corrosion may lead to higher than anticipated rates of nickel ion release or compromised mechanical integrity. If nitinol is in contact with dissimilar metals, galvanic corrosion testing should be considered. FDA recommends the methods described in ASTM F3044. And as an alternative to using devices for galvanic corrosion testing, coupons representing an expected worst-case galvanic coupling that are subjected to identical manufacturing processes could be used. In addition, a scientific justification may be provided in lieu of testing if the expected worst-case potential shift due to galvanic coupling is small and if the relative surface ratios of the cathodic to anodic materials are low. And here they give an example of a marker band to stent surface ratio. And then in terms of biocompatibility, FDA references the biocompatibility biological evaluation guidance in terms of ISO 10993-1. And in addition, if in vitro nickel release testing will be conducted, a risk assessment should be performed to compare the amount of nickel released from the device to a tolerable intake value for nickel. For adverse systemic effects that may occur following prolonged or permanent patient exposure to nickel released from a nickel-containing device, with the exception of hypersensitivity, CDRH recommends a TI value for parenteral exposure to nickel, and this value is based on systemic toxicity data from experimental animals following administration of nickel salts by parenteral routes of exposure. Here's some values that they're recommending. And here, the FDA has not established an oral tolerable intake for nickel. However, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has established a reference dose here. And if any in vivo nickel exposure data exists for your device, these values should also be included in your risk assessment. As the lower limit of nickel exposure that can elicit allergic reactions in some patients is not known, it's not possible to derive a hypersensitivity based tolerable intake for nickel released from nitinol. Therefore, appropriate labeling is recommended. And if your nickel exposure estimate exceeds the recommended tolerable intake, an alternative tolerable intake may be derived in certain cases. And here, FDA provides some additional links. And then in terms of labeling and warnings, again, because there is no known lower limit on the amount of nickel that can elicit allergic reactions in some patients, FDA recommends that the risk of potential allergic reaction to nickel be mitigated through labeling for nitinol-containing devices. Specifically, they recommend this warning statement or something similar be included in your device labeling. And here they also call out that a contraindication against use of nitinol-containing devices may be appropriate when the risk of use clearly outweigh any probable benefit. And that's the end of the guidance document. So just want to go ahead and thank you for joining me today, and again, reiterate a couple of our key takeaways from today's video. 1, general information about materials and manufacturing. 2, considerations for mechanical testing and analyses. And 3, recommendations for use of corrosion testing methods. So thank you very much for joining me in today's video. I do hope that you found it informative and useful. Please like and subscribe and provide comments. We really do rely on your comments to improve the quality of our videos and make sure that we're providing content that you are actually looking for. So thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful day.